September 1967, Quang Tri Province. An M48 Patton has just taken its fourth RPG hit in 20 minutes. The turret ring is jammed. The radio's gone. The driver is unconscious. The commander, Sergeant Dale Hansen, 22 years old, has two options: abandon the tank and run through 400 yards of open ground under fire, or stay inside 50 tons of burning steel and fight with what is left. He stays. What happens next is why they called the M48 the tank that could not be stopped, and why the men who fought inside it never forgot what it cost them to survive. Inside the M48, the air barely moved. Sweat pooled on the floor plates, mixing with spilled oil and the sharp tang of burnt propellant. 4 men worked shoulder to shoulder in a space barely big enough for 2. The tank's 50 tons of steel trapped the heat, pushing the thermometer past 130 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no air conditioning, only the constant churn of the engine, recycling the same stifling air thick with diesel fumes and cordite smoke. Every time the 90mm gun fired, a shockwave rattled the hull, ringing in the ears and leaving a high-pitched whine that never seemed to fade. For the loader, the job meant wrestling heavy shells in a haze of smoke, hands blistered from catching spent brass still hot enough to burn through gloves. One slip and a casing could sear a mark that lasted for weeks. The gunner's world narrowed to the sight and the trigger, eyes straining through streaked periscopes. The commander, cramped under the cupola, juggled maps, radios, and the lives of his crew, all while ducking the next incoming round. The driver, half blind through his vision blocks, felt every jolt as the tank lurched over roots and shell craters. Each man lived with the knowledge that a jammed hatch or a stuck turret could turn the whole tank into a coffin. The only relief came with the hatch cracked open, risking a sniper's bullet for a breath of cooler air. In this furnace, the line between survival and disaster was measured in seconds and inches. Jungle roads like Route 9 were ambush alleys, where the M48's armor counted for little against threats hiding in the green. North Vietnamese teams set up within 50 yards, sometimes closer, using the thick vegetation to vanish until the moment of attack. The RPG-2 and RPG-7, their warheads armed only after traveling a short distance, forced the enemy to wait until the tank was almost on top of them. That meant point-blank shots, where the difference between a dud and a kill was measured in a few steps. Commanders often fought with their heads out of the cupola, desperate for a clear view in the choking undergrowth. They scanned for muzzle flashes, trip wires, the glint of a rocket tube, but this made them easy targets, one exposed silhouette and the first to fall if a gunner hesitated. In these moments, the tank's bulk became a liability. The jungle closed in, blocking the main gun's depression, leaving sappers and RPG teams to work at knife range. A single misjudged distance could mean an RPG failed to arm, sparing the crew by inches, or it could detonate inside the hatch, turning steel into a trap. The paradox was brutal. The closer the enemy, the more likely the tank would survive the blast, if the crew survived at all. Convoy duty meant rolling dice with every mile. Mines were the unseen enemy, buried deep in the red mud of Route 9 and the roads around Quang Tri. The M48's hull, curved like the bottom of a boat, wasn't just for show. When a pressure mine or a buried artillery shell went off beneath 50 tons of steel, that curve could mean the difference between a crippled tank and a dead crew. The blast would slam into the belly, sometimes lifting the entire tank off the ground, but the force would arc outward, vented by the hull's shape, sparing the compartment where 4 men braced for the worst. Tracks and road wheels could be torn away, leaving the tank stranded, but more often than not, the crew survived to tell the tale. Still, the fear never left. Every driver had his own ritual, a lucky coin, a silent prayer, or a hand pressed to the hatch before moving out. The knowledge that immobilization meant becoming a sitting target haunted every mile. Crews learned to zigzag, to never follow the same path twice. But in the end, it was luck and steel that decided who made it through the minefields and who didn't. A.U. 1968. The M48 tanks rolled into a city already shattered by days of street fighting. Concrete and rebar replaced jungle, but the threat only multiplied. North Vietnamese soldiers waited in cellars behind collapsed walls and on rooftops, armed with rocket-propelled grenades that turned every intersection into a kill zone. Tanks advanced block by block, often leading the way for the infantry, their hulls scraping against buildings as they forced a path through barricades and rubble. Doctrine said tanks belonged in open country, but in Hue the M48 became a battering ram, sometimes literally. Crews smashed through walls, clearing paths with brute force when their guns couldn't depress low enough to hit enemies crouched just yards away. The price was counted in scars on steel. Some tanks took over 100 rocket-propelled grenade hits in a matter of days. Each impact sent a shockwave through the armor, spraying the interior with red-hot fragments, spalling that could kill or maim without ever breaching the hull. The men inside learned to fear the hiss of molten metal more than the thunder of the blast itself. Survival meant adapting. Hatches sealed tight, eyes straining for the flash of a rocket tube, nerves stretched thin as the tank became both shield and trap. The old manuals had nothing to say about fighting house to house, but the crews wrote their own rules in the dust and blood of Hue. A disabled M48 sat exposed in the rubble, its tracks blown off, hatches jammed, and sappers crawling closer with satchel charges. The radio crackled. An order came down from an adjacent commander. Load canister, fire at the friendly tank's position. It was a gamble that meant risking the men inside, but letting the enemy reach the hull would mean certain death for the crew. The loader slammed a canister round into the breach. The shell was packed with 1,281 steel pellets, each one the size of a ball bearing. The gunner took aim not at the enemy, but at the tank they had fought beside only hours before. At point-blank range, the 90mm gun barked. The blast shredded the ground around the immobilized tank, scattering sappers and sending a cloud of dust and metal through the smoke-filled street. Inside the disabled M48, the crew braced for the impact, trusting that their own armor would hold. When the dust settled, all 4 men were alive. The sappers were gone. In that moment, survival depended not just on steel, but on the trust between crews, one tank firing on another, betting everything that the armor would do its job. March 3, 1969. The Ben Het Special Forces camp lay shrouded in darkness, just miles from the Laotian border. Out beyond the wire, Soviet-built PT-76 tanks crept forward, their engines barely audible above the wind. Inside the M48s of the 1st Battalion, 69th Armor, gunners pressed sweating faces to infrared sights, scanning for any sign of movement. This was no ambush in the jungle. This was steel against steel, the first American tank battle since Korea. The night erupted in flashes. The M48's 90mm gun thundered, its muzzle blast lighting up the hilltop. The first shell struck a PT-76, igniting its ammunition in a burst so bright it was seen for miles. The air filled with the sharp tang of burning fuel and the metallic stench of ruptured steel. Enemy rounds ricocheted off the Patton's armor, but the crew stayed locked in, trusting the thick steel between them and the chaos outside. Infrared optics gave the Americans a ghostly edge. Gunners tracked enemy tanks by the faintest glimmer, squeezing off shots before the PT-76s could close. One by one, the Soviet tanks burned. When the shooting stopped, the ground was littered with wreckage. M48s were battered but alive, proof that in open battle, the Pattons' firepower and armor could still decide the night. For the young men inside, victory was measured in the pounding of their hearts and the knowledge that, for one night, their machine had been enough. Most of the men who fought inside the M48 were barely out of high school. The average crewman was just 19, old enough to drive a tank, but not old enough to buy a beer back home. Their names rarely made it into the official reports. The Army counted tanks lost and battles won, but not the scars that followed these young men out of the jungle. Fred Kellogg was one of them. After his tank took a direct hit, medics pulled 73 fragments of steel from his body. He survived, but the wounds never really healed. For many, injuries meant a quick trip stateside and a lifetime of silence. Others carried burns, hearing loss, and shrapnel under their skin for decades. The M48's armor could stop a blast, but it couldn't shield a 19-year-old from what waited outside or what came after. In the end, it was the crew's courage and luck, not the tank's reputation, that decided who went home. In the spring of 1972, along the banks of the Cam Lo and the battered streets of Dong Ha, South Vietnamese tank commanders, some barely older than their crews, faced a wave of nearly 200,000 North Vietnamese troops and Soviet-built T-54s. Outnumbered and outgunned, M48s from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam stood their ground. In the first weeks of the Easter Offensive, these tanks destroyed over 90 enemy vehicles, holding the line long enough for battered infantry to regroup. When the final tanks were abandoned in 1975, their hulls captured and displayed as trophies, the story of survival did not end. The curved V-hull that had vented mine blasts in Vietnam became a blueprint for future armor. The lessons about crew protection, about the limits of steel, about the cost of resilience, echoed in the design of the M1 Abrams and in tanks still serving decades later in Turkey, Taiwan, and Greece. For the men who fought inside the Patton, victory was measured in days survived and friends brought home. The rest was left to history and the silent hulks rusting in the grass. Inside those steel walls, heat scorched skin, and every breath mixed with diesel and fear. 50 tons of armor could shield a crew from mines, but never from memory. Today, armored vehicles still evolve, but the real weight remains, borne by those who survived the impossible. Share your perspective below.